We've all heard, or maybe even said, she's so toxic. That relationship is so toxic. And then some of us might have had the thought, oh, wait a second, am I toxic? Because some of that sounds a lot like me. In today's video, we're gonna talk about what toxic actually means. I'll outline toxic traits with specific examples so that you can get a feel for if it actually applies to you. And then we're also gonna talk about some of the common reasons that people are toxic in relationships. Welcome to Fem Forward. If you haven't already, ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new content. I'm Cynthia King and I'm a clinical psychologist. Along with my co-founder, Ariana Vadi, we will be putting out new videos each week, all dedicated to helping you have better relationships with your children, your family members, your coworkers, your partners, all the important relationships. Hopefully you'll learn something new today that you can start applying in your important relationships. Let's get started. So one of the dangers as referring to ourselves as toxic or someone else as toxic is that it's a sweeping generalization to describe someone's way of relating to others. And sweeping generalizations are rarely accurate. So it's a big label and it's a big statement. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we're using the word toxic accurately. And to be clear, toxic is not a definable mental health disorder. I'm not going to diagnose someone with toxicity if they come into my office. So when we're talking about this, we're really talking about how the word toxic is used in popular culture. So let's think about it. None of us show up as our best selves in our relationships all the time. We have all raised our voices. We have all said mean things or things that we didn't mean. And we have all hurt other people's feelings. Does that in and of itself make us toxic? Absolutely not. So when we use the word toxic, we should be using it to describe an established pattern of unhealthy behavior that is a common thread in most or all of our relationships, most of the time. We use the terminology in psychology, state versus trait, to really make this differentiation. A state is a temporary way of being, while a trait tends to be a more stable and enduring characteristic or pattern of behavior. So when we're referring to a toxic person, we're referring to that as a trait characteristic. So that means that this should be an enduring trait that consistently permeates how we interact with other people. So the good news is you get to have a bad day, you get to mess up, you get to raise your voice sometimes, and that's a state of being. That doesn't mean you're a toxic human being. So a hallmark toxic trait is unhealthy communication with others. And some of these are self-explanatory and others I'll go into more detail about. So first we have things like yelling, name calling, gaslighting. So let's flesh this out a little bit because I know it's being used a lot in popular culture. So gaslighting is a subtle form of emotional manipulation where the person actually makes the recipient question their own reality, and usually by creating a false narrative. And the person who's doing the gaslighting can do this in several ways: by lying, outright denying that what happened actually happened, shifting blame, or discrediting the other person. We also have stonewalling, and stonewalling is basically completely withdrawing and shutting down from the conversation. So you become entirely unresponsive. Then we have contempt, and even the word itself, contempt is when we're coming from a place where we think we know better or we are better than the other person. And this can show up as sarcasm, mocking, nasty things like that. Not all types of communication are verbal. We also have some really toxic nonverbals that we can use, such as eye rolling, body posture, like you might make it big and intimidating, tone of voice. All of those are nonverbal cues that can be just as toxic as what we're actually saying. And if some of this unhealthy communication sounds like you're in luck because we do have a How to Communicate Better workshop, and I'll link that in the video description below. So other toxic behaviors include trying to assign blame. So this can look like it's never your fault, it's always someone else's fault. It can also look like trying to find blame or a culprit, even when it's not warranted or necessary. You're just doing it to make the other person feel bad. Tendency to be critical. And remember that critical is different than a complaint. A complaint is targeting a specific behavior, whereas criticism is targeting someone's personhood. Putting people through love tests, and this one's a tricky one because it's really covert. So just as an example, this could be that you have asked your partner for something specific for your birthday. And what they don't know is that if you don't get that specific item, it means that they don't love you. Right? So they are taking a test they don't know about, which makes it really easy to fail. And the test itself isn't actually accurate as to whether someone loves you or not. But it might feel accurate to you, which is why you're doing it. Other characteristics include being really controlling or needing to smother those that you're with emotionally. Defensiveness, your need to be right overrules other people's feelings. And last, you don't apologize or you do it really poorly. So a really crummy apology would sound like, oh, I'm sorry you felt that way about it. Or, oh, sorry, like I didn't know you were so sensitive. So those are apologies that masquerade as apologies, but aren't actually apologies because they're not requiring you to take any ownership. If you want to learn more about toxic traits, check out the link to our article in the video description below. And if you want to get a sense of how many toxic traits you have or someone you love has, check out the link to our toxic test in the video description below. So you might be wondering, why am I toxic? How did I become this way? And usually we learn from our caregivers how to communicate with other people. So it could be that you had really poor modeling around what this should look like, because maybe your caregivers had toxic behaviors and maybe their parents had toxic behaviors. So usually when we're having these toxic ways of being in relationships, it's because we actually don't know how to do it any differently. It's a skills deficit. So the other side of this is that a lot of folks who show up as toxic in their relationships might have come from really abusive or traumatic homes. So again, they may not actually know how to behave differently. And the second part of this is being toxic is an awesome defense mechanism because it really keeps people at distance from you. So it's sort of like bite before getting bitten, essentially. It's super protective. One of my old professors used to say, nobody wants to hug a porcupine, right? You can really protect yourself with these toxic behaviors because it keeps people at bay. And for folks who have experienced a lot of trauma, as much as they want connection, connection has also come with a lot of betrayal. So if you did come from a pretty traumatic or abusive home, and you do know that you're having some of these toxic behaviors, it could mean that you have a lot of work to do in processing what happened to you and learning how to move differently through the world. So what's the answer to the $1 million question? Am I toxic? Maybe, maybe not. For most of you, even if you have trouble in relationships, you're not a toxic person. If you noticed a lot more traits than you're comfortable with, you might be bringing some toxicity to your relationships. And maybe you are the toxic person 9 times out of 10 in your relationship. So let's dig a little deeper. What are some other things in relationships that might cue you in to you being the toxic person? Are you having trouble in a lot or most of your relationships? Do you have trouble maintaining friendships or even making friends to begin with? Are heated arguments typical of your relationships? Do you get or have you gotten feedback that your behavior in relationships is damaging, too much, or off-putting? Thanks for joining me today. We are doing a toxic series, so ring that notification bell so you don't miss out, because we will be talking about how to know if you're in a toxic relationship, the types of toxic relationships, and how to fix a toxic relationship.